If you find the news about climate change distressing, imagine how climate scientists feel. For years now, their research has returned data that points to a looming global climate crisis. And despite an overwhelming consensus among the world's experts, there are still those that deny it's even happening. How do they keep on keeping on? Well, let's find out. In Washington, D.C., we welcome Dr. Lisa Van Susteren, a psychiatrist specializing in the mental health effects of climate change and a board member of Physicians for Social Responsibility. In State College, Pennsylvania, via Skype, Michael Mann, distinguished professor of atmospheric science and director of the Earth System Science Center at Penn State University. And here in our studio, Matthew Hoffman, co-director of the Environmental Governance Lab and professor of political science at the University of Toronto Scarborough, and Jason Thistlethwaite, professor, School of Environment, Enterprise and Development at the University of Waterloo. And we are delighted to have you two gentlemen here in our studio and our friends in Points Beyond on our program tonight. Just to set up this discussion, I thought I'd read a few quotes here from some of your colleagues to sort of set the table for the discussion to come. Here's scientist Camille Parmesan, who shared the Nobel Prize with Al Gore in 2007, saying that she became, quote, professionally depressed studying climate change. Another climate journalist, Eric Holthaus, wrote in 2018, I lose sleep over climate change almost every single night. I can't remember how long this has been happening, but it's been quite a while, and it's only getting worse. I confess I need help. He went to counseling for what he called his soul-crushing climate despair. And one more, activist Jillian Caldwell, who wrote, I believe that I and many other people around the world are suffering from, quote, climate trauma. It's my own term. I am not a mental health professional, but I can identify plain as day the symptoms I recognize in myself and in my colleagues traumatized by our work to tackle climate change. Okay, Lisa, please get us started on this. Let's start with a mental health professional. How would you characterize what some scientists and activists are saying that they're experiencing?
It's clear that they're responding emotionally to what is a very legitimate condition. And that is that the climate is crashing and we have enormous consequences. So for them not to be experiencing these kinds of emotions would be odd. They would be out of touch with what they are actually surrounded by. So entirely legitimate in my mind. Let's
do a quick follow-up here. We've all heard of post-traumatic stress, but you have called this pre-traumatic stress. What does that mean?
Pre-traumatic stress is like post-traumatic stress disorder, except that you're experiencing these symptoms before the events happen. But, you know, even when I started using the term pre-traumatic stress, it was before we saw so many catastrophes. And now it's not even legitimate to call it pre-traumatic stress, except in the sense that people are imagining or conjuring even worse consequences down the road.
Michael Mann, tell us, can you relate to these experiences as I've just described them?
Yeah, well, after hearing all this, now I truly do feel depressed.
Sorry.
It's a bit odd. As a scientist studying the science of climate change on a day-by-day basis, you can become sensitized to it. You're so used to studying it in terms of numbers and figures and graphs and equations that sometimes you lose sight of the reality. And the real threat that climate change constitutes. But there are moments where you do experience that intensely. When I was with my daughter and wife down in the Florida Keys some years ago when she was very young, and it just sort of struck me that this is at threat. This is under threat by climate change. This amazing, natural wonder is under threat. And when I read to my daughter or I talk to her about climate change, it really starts to hit home that, this isn't just about the facts and the figures and the graphs. This is about, the fundamental threat that climate change represents, not just to us, but to our children and grandchildren, and the legacy of the actions that we take today. And so for me, it's actually in a way empowering. The fact that I'm reminded of that means that I recognize that there's something much larger at stake here than just understanding the issue of climate change. And it actually gives me the energy that I need, knowing that we can still influence the path that we follow and the future of our children and grandchildren gives me the energy and the passion to continue on battling to communicate the reality of the science and its implications.
Okay, let's get some reaction here in the studio. Matthew?
Well, as a social scientist, as someone who studies climate politics, I feel what Michael and Lisa are talking about all the time. And my students ask if I feel despair about climate change and global environmental problems, and I tell them it depends on the day.
What were you telling me before we started taping?
Yeah, and
what's the question they ask?
The question I ask at the beginning of all these classes that I teach is, should we have this class or should we just go to the beach, right? And give up. And that sense is real for people that study the politics of climate change, I think, in a real visceral way, because we keep up on the science. We're not producing climate science in a natural scientist way, but we keep up on the science. But we also are intimately familiar with why societies are having such a hard time doing something with that science and why societies face such challenges in making the kind of transformation that we need. And so I read the IPCC reports, I see the scientific reports, and they make me sad. And then I go to work and say, okay, how do we think about the way societies can transform? And that makes me sad. And so I don't want to get in a despair contest, but social scientists are facing these very same kind of really mental pressures in terms of what we do on a day-to-day basis.
And let me guess, this show isn't doing much for your normally good humor either.
Well, it's nice to talk about it with people that are going through the same thing.
Jason, how about you?
And to that point, that's actually one of the things that I think we can do to try and alleviate some of this anxiety is to talk openly about it, not just among, in these environments, but among family and friends as well. And it's indeed in those conversations that you do get a sense of some of the anxiety around this. A big one being, I've people my age and my friends, we have young children. So how do you, for instance, reconcile some of the impossible decisions you have to make on a daily basis? Things like driving a car, single-use items, all of these things are contributing to a burden that my 2-year-old doesn't even know exists yet. So I think that's definitely a significant source of anxiety that we're trying to pull apart. And then, of course, as Matt said, on the social science side of things, there's just this anxiety that we know a lot of the solutions. We know a lot of particularly in my area, I'm interested in sort of how we manage the risks of climate change. And we know a lot of the good ideas, policies, technical solutions, and they exist. But there's this anxiety that we can't convince ourselves or our leaders to adopt them or do anything about them.
Well, speaking of children, Michael, I've heard you in the past talk about reading that famous Dr. Seuss book, The Lorax, to your child and feeling overcome by it. Tell me why.
Yeah, when you get to the end of the book, of course, there's a very solemn moment where you're confronted with, the reality of the destruction of the environment. And it's the very last tree has been cut down. And I remember when my daughter was very young, I think she was only about 3 or 4. And I read that book to her because it was a book that inspired me. But I was sort of caught by surprise at just how emotionally impacted she was. And she cried at the end of that. And I tried to explain to her that actually it's a hopeful story. Yes, some terrible things have happened, but it ends on a note of hopeful, cautious optimism. And so that is, in a sense, influenced the larger approach that I take to communicating the science and its implications, because there is great suffering that's already happening. There's more suffering that we can no longer avoid just because of the warming that's already locked in, the climate change that's already baked in. But there's so much suffering we can still prevent. And every additional, ton of carbon that we don't emit into the atmosphere, every bit of fossil fuels that we don't burn, every bit of action that we can engage in makes the future a little better. It's not a cliff that we fall off. It's more like a minefield that we're walking onto, and we have to make sure that we don't walk further onto that minefield. We do everything we can. How much climate change is dangerous? Any amount of climate change. How much do we need to prevent? Any climate change that we can prevent.
All right, to that end, Lisa, let me get to you from your vantage point. Do you see in scientists and researchers, the various stages of grief?
I do, but they aren't likely to bring it up to me. Typically, people will focus on what they're doing, what they have found in their research. And if I push a little bit, they'll talk about what their anxieties are. But people who are involved in this arena, who are working, tend to use as a coping mechanism that focus on the work that they're doing. And that's really good because their work is important. And it really underscores what all of us can be doing, and that is that we understand, accept the anxiety. We talk directly to people about what's bothering them, what the threats are, what the consequences are going to be. And like the old medical model, you go from telling a person what's going to happen to saying, here's what you can do about it. And if there's one thing that I think that we're not really good at, it's segueing from look at this awful fire and this storm and et cetera, high winds and drought and sea level rise, and segueing to here's what you can do personally yourself, in your community, inspiring others to take action. That second point is often left on the table.
Jason, I've heard you talk about a feeling of homesickness. What does that refer to?
Yeah, this is actually a concept that now it's been recognized by a number of psychiatrists and psychologists, and it's kind of the opposite of nostalgia. It's called solastalgia, where you're homesick for the place that you live now. So you're homesick for the world that you grew up in and the changes that are happening around it. So a few examples of this are in Inuit communities, for instance. They're finding that they're feeling anxious because they can no longer access pieces of land that they, for generations, had access to. The one thing that I think about from the perspective of the last few summers here locally in Ontario and Canada is that summer sunset that you're so looking forward to do, escaping the heat of the day, being out in the nice, cool weather, and it's hazy because there's smoke from Western wildfires. And that isn't even just to speak about, the cloud and the haze that are experiencing out there. And this has been the last 2 summers. So, it's just going to become somewhat of a new normal where we're going to lose this part of our summers that really is a part of our identity and a part of how we grew up.
Matt, let me try this with you. When you told us a moment ago that you read all the IPCC reports, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. When the last one came out, do you recall what your reaction was at the time?
Yeah, it was schizophrenic in some ways, right? Not technically. So I read it, and there's not a ton of new information in there. IPCC reports are not about new information, but it was framed in a really important way to try and generate anxiety and urgency, and it did. That worked, right?
Because even though they buried it when they released it.
That's right, and the discussion around it that comes out immediately makes you focus on the challenge of that transformation, right? And so your first thought is, especially as someone who's been trying to study the challenges of transformation, is that we just don't have the transformative capacity right now to do what's necessary. But the second day, so the first day you're sort of like, we're screwed. The second day, you get back to work. And one of the things that's, I think, and this harkens to something that Lisa talked about in terms of the agency involved, what can you do? And that's, I think, important for both scientists and the general public to think along those lines. And one of the things, a paradox about the enormity of the challenge of climate change is that, yes, that makes it a huge challenge, but it also means that there are an incredible number of ways that you can participate in working on climate change, because it's about building resilient, sustainable, just communities. It is about finding new technologies. It is about changing your everyday life.
That is all true. However, I've read accounts from scientists who've said, we're not going to have children because we're just not going to bring kids into such a hopeless world. When you're reading those reports and you're having one of your bad days, what goes through your head?
What goes through my head on those bad days is it's talking, and it's somewhat of a cliche, but talking to my son when he's in high school and he asks me, are we gonna fix this? Is this gonna get better? And on my bad days, I'm like, well, I don't know, right? I never have gotten to the point where I say no, right? Because I think that's...
Can't take away all his hope.
No, well, and I'm not there, right? And the uncertainty of the future, I think, is really important for hope. And so, but on those bad days, because what he's asking, I think, when he says, are we going to fix this, is there not hope left, but is there agency left? Are there things that individuals and communities can still do to work on this?
Well, let me follow up with Michael on this, because first of all, there's a great piece in Esquire magazine that if people haven't read it, they should go online and read this piece, because you really are, in some respects, the poster child of people who have made this their life's work, who have received, I mean, you've been denounced, you've been investigated, you've got death threats, you've been accused of, everything under the sun. Some people said, or one person said, you should be shot, quartered, fed to the pigs along with your whole I mean, you've heard all this stuff before.
That's one of the nicer things. Yeah.
What impact on you personally has being the well-known public face of this meant to you?
Well, I'll tell you, it's actually inspired me to do more. Because, at some level, we wouldn't be attacked this way if there wasn't something important about our message. And I wanted to return to this issue of agency in that context and return to the tale of the Lorax, because it is a tale. It ends on a message of agency, of hope. There's one seed that's still left, and the child has the ability to determine her destiny and the destiny of her world. It all lies with her. And the same thing is true with climate change, as we've been discussing here. There's so many things that we can do to reduce our own personal carbon footprint, and it makes us, in many cases, healthier and happier, saves us money, all these things that we ought to be doing anyways. But of course, in the end, it's about a shift in the incentives, in our economy, moving away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy. And that requires collective action. That requires us getting together and making sure that we force the hand of our policymakers and make sure that our politicians will do what's right for us rather than the special interests who too often fund their campaigns. And so there's agency there as well, and getting out in the street and demonstrating and voting and raising public awareness. We have to do all of these things, and all of them are empowering.
Lisa, let me read something to you that was in The Guardian last October, just after the IPCC report came out. And here we go. This is Rebecca Solnit writing. Taking action is the best way to live in conditions of crisis and violation for your spirit and your conscience, as well as for society. It's entirely compatible with grief and horror. You can work to elect climate heroes while being sad. There are no guarantees, but just as Soviet dissidents Sakharov and Sharansky probably didn't imagine that the Soviet Union would dissolve itself in the early 1990s, so we can anticipate that we don't exactly know what will happen and how our actions will help shape the future. Knowing that we don't know isn't grounds for confidence, but it is fuel against despair, which is a form of certainty. This future is as uncertain as it's ever been. What do we do with that, Lisa?
Well, she's right. There are those stages of grief and bargaining and anger and all the rest. And we need to take the energy of those emotions and turn it into action. And this is what we're talking about, this empowering action. With any situation, challenge that we're faced with, if we just are kicking it around and thinking about it and not doing anything about it, the anxiety sits there. And I want to underscore again that any time we are out talking to the public, any of us, or with our friends and relatives, the issue is, what do we want to communicate? And one of the things that is so important is that we want to go from being bystanders, watching what's happening, to upstanders who look at the diffusion of responsibility of a bystander and say, I can do something. I can signal to all the people around me that my carbon footprint has been reduced by specific actions, and that these social norms that we create are much more powerful sometimes than anything we can say. So it's a grassroots and a grass tops impact on people. But those social norms, when we reach tipping points, we saw we don't drink and drive, we practice safe sex, we don't smoke, blow smoke in people's faces. These social norms can change a culture very quickly, and that's where we've got to be.
Jason, I wonder if part of the trick here is that scientists think that they can solve every problem under the sun. And this may be one that they can't solve. And that takes them down into the slough of despond, I guess.
Yeah, we know that warming is programmed into our system and that we're going to see unavoidable changes in the world around us. But at the same time, there are solutions, policies, and ideas that you see changing. The norm is changing towards them, for instance. So ideas about renewable energy, not driving to work, at all scales. Some of these ideas are normatively different in the incoming generations. They don't take. There's very little climate denialism. In fact, very little, and they feel empowered because they take for granted that this is what we're going to have to do.
You say there's very little, but the guy with the biggest microphone in the world is part of it.
Yes, yes, and this is a challenge that I think all of us have to deal with on a daily basis, and that's actually, as the social scientist in me, is the greatest source of anxiety. Is that despite knowing that we have the power, the resources, and the ideas of how to solve this problem, you have people that and their ideas that tend to get into power in situations and further perpetuate that fear and anxiety.
Well, one of the reasons that this whole issue that we're talking about tonight exploded, it actually was about 4 or 5 years ago. There was a climate scientist in Scandinavia named Jason Box. And again, going back to that Esquire piece I talked about earlier, he put the following tweet out. He said, "If even a small fraction of Arctic sea floor carbon is released to the atmosphere, we're effed." Michael, what's the best way to communicate science to the public, in your view, with that kind of brutal honesty, or maybe with some restraint and optimism, even if you don't truly feel it?
Well, a little bit of both, because the truth is in between. Jason's a good friend of mine, but I did comment on Twitter myself, Michael E. Mann on Twitter, about that particular tweet. And my point was, it's not binary. It's not effed or not effed. It's a matter of how effed. that is left for us to determine. The more carbon we burn, the worse it gets. The less carbon we burn, the better chance we have of preserving this climate and this planet for ourselves, our children, and grandchildren. And once again, it points to the agency that we've been discussing here. We can become active participants. We don't have to watch this from the sidelines. There are all these things that we can do from an individual standpoint and from a collective standpoint to try to make sure that our legacy will not be the destruction of our planet.
Lisa, can I get you on that? The best way, in your judgment, of communicating around these issues?
Well, first of all, I'm mindful. I agree with what Michael says, obviously. It's not a binary issue. And I'm mindful of the lead-tainted water in Flint. People need to know, and they will be very angry and upset if you downplay or suggest that the data is not reliable. They need to know the truth. The public needs to hear, because after all, if it isn't urgent, then what's the reason? If it's not a crisis, what's the need for urgent action? So we need to talk to the public, but again, you can't pull a person's pants down and then without turning around and segueing immediately to here's what we can do about it. That's where the legitimacy of telling the public the truth is. And again, with the facts, we're in much better shape than if we're trying to pretend putting a rosy picture on things.
Okay, let me do a follow-up with you, because I need a good psychiatrist again to help me with this one here. People may believe in climate change. They may see that their actions are contributing to it. They watch the news and they see what's happening around the world. They can believe it. At the same time, they may feel it's going to solve itself, or it's not going to be a problem for decades. I don't really have to do anything about this, and therefore are in a state of emotional denial. Can you explain to us how those things can happen simultaneously?
There are myriad ways and reasons why people deny, discount, disavow. In this particular case, it sounds like it's a dependency issue where you say somebody else will take care of it. People sometimes deny because it's emasculating to be a scaredy cat. People will deny because their political life depends on it. They will deny because they are a member of a group that would ostracize them if they questioned a tightly held value, which was to discount the impact. People deny or discount because it is unnerving to think that God or the world would somehow fall apart. God wouldn't do this to us. And so there's an optimism bias just because of the inertia in our way of thinking. We've never seen things like this before. So there are countless reasons why we deny. Certainly, people don't want to talk about climate at a dinner party, which I can shut down in minutes, because it is associated with this sense of death and dying and irretrievable loss and things like that. But that's because, again, we are not segueing to what the social norm, what we can do by talking to people and saying, look, I don't pay for electricity anymore. I got solar panels on my roof. You should do it too. You don't have to say a word about climate change. There are all sorts of tricks, communications tricks that can get people to act quickly.
Matt, you can or cannot discuss this at a dinner party?
I can, but I've even been warned now lately before I open my mouth to keep it down. But invariably, I keep it down for a while, and then they're starting to talk about a football team or something else, all very interesting. But I start getting ratcheting up, and pretty soon out it comes.
Matthew, how about you? Can you talk to your friends about this? No, I'm going to Matthew here. Go ahead.
Yes and no.
Yeah?
Sometimes I don't want to talk about it because, frankly, talking about it makes me depressed. But I think, though, that, and getting back to this notion of telling the truth, at a dinner party, this is, I think, important that a certain amount of fear and anxiety, the truth about climate change is actually necessary to generate action. The problem is, the paradox is too much generates inaction, because then we're like, well, then the feelings of not having agency. And so I think that Lisa's right, telling the stories about what can be done, and also I think imagining a low carbon future, imagining what society can look like moving forward is actually, that's where you get some really empowering. And that's what I like to talk about at dinner parties, is not the sort of what we're losing, but the stuff from my own research and from other people's research about what we're heading towards if we can kind of take the action that we know is necessary.
Michael, how about you on that? Can you talk to other people about it without them saying to you, okay, we've heard enough?
Maybe this is why everybody leaves my dinner parties before the main course is served. You know, you can. And as a scientist, I understand the science. I understand the projections. I know what the uncertainties are and what the limitations are. And that actually, once again, is empowering, because I know that we can still avert catastrophic climate change. Too often, we encounter individuals who are convinced that there's nothing we can do, that we've gone past some, tipping point. There are individuals who have made a name for themselves by arguing that we will be extinct in 10 years because of exponential climate change, whatever that means, and there's nothing that we can do about it. And that's simply wrong. It would be one thing if that were true, but it's not. An objective assessment of the science tells us there is great urgency, bad things are happening, more bad things are going to happen inevitably, but we can prevent the worst. The science, the math tells us that.
Let me ask our director for a second, if he can go on a wide shot, and I don't know if you can get everybody on all at once, but I wonder, in the midst of your lecturing to your students, whether any of you, and I'm sorry, I don't want to get too touchy-feely here, but I mean, this is what our subject is about tonight. Anybody started to cry or broken down or just had an emotional moment where you were overcome? Anybody?
Yep.
Michael, I see you nodding.
Yep.
What happened?
Yep. Sometimes I'll be talking about not just the science, but the denial industry and the things that fossil fuel interest did to lead us astray, that are so like what the tobacco industry did decades ago to lead us astray on the health impacts of tobacco. And I'll tear up, especially when I'm talking to an audience of young people, because what a terrible injustice we've done them, or we've allowed others to do them, by misleading them on what is arguably the greatest challenge we face as a civilization. Sometimes I tear up just describing that, talking about that.
Well, one of the ironies of this program is I can't recall a time I laughed as much as I did during a program than tonight. So you all handled the depressing part of this and also the good humor part of this quite well. So thank you for that. And finally, as well, let me answer the question that everybody is probably thinking right now and wants me to confirm one way or another. Yes, Lisa is Greta Van Susteren's sister. So there, we got that settled as well. I want to thank Lisa Van Susteren for being there for us from Washington, D.C., Michael Mann from State College, Pennsylvania, Jason Thistlethwaite from the University of Waterloo, Matthew Hoffman from the University of Toronto, Scarborough. Great of all of you to come on TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.